Welcome, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today, my guest is Greg Melcher from New Generation Warfare Center in Washington, D.C. Hi, Greg.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are.
Okay. Since we are going to talk about the situation in the region here in Europe, in Poland, in NATO Eastern Flank, about the acquisition, about strategy culture, about geostrategy, about all aspects pertaining to both the strategic situation and also to the way the countries here in the region are doing things in terms of defense and stuff. Greg, I've known you quite for a long time. We've done some wargaming together in Romania and Poland and elsewhere. But if you could just introduce yourself a little bit more to the audience so that they get to know you better. I think we haven't recorded it.
Okay, sure, happy to. So my background, I was actually initial degree was a electrical engineering degree, and this was the time of when Ronald Reagan came back into power, and there was going to be a large defense up in the U.S. So my first job was I went to work for the commands, the Navy commands that build ships and aircraft and all the various acquisitions and associated research and development for the Navy. So I walked in at the ground zero of the beginning of a brand new program. And I went through all phases of acquisition, from concept development to initial prototyping to production and fielding. So I took a system through the entire life cycle. I, of course, was on the government side working. I wasn't in the Navy. I was a civilian working for the Navy's acquisition agency. So I became very familiar with the planning, programming, and budgeting system in the U.S. and how the whole acquisition system works. At one point, I was certified as an acquisition professional so that I could be permitted to manage the largest, what we called at the time, ACAT-1 programs. Essentially, it's the major programs, the billion-dollar programs. So I had that background. I did that for a decade. Then I moved more into the analytical world in a different command, and eventually ended up working for the Chief of Naval Operations for about a decade. And there I was in the what is called the assessment division, but essentially at those days, we had all of the funding to pay for the studies and analysis to determine what sort of Navy we needed to buy. So in those years, I had oversight of the Navy's federal funded Research and Development Center, which is a nonprofit study agency called the Center for Navy Analysis Corporation. So I was in charge of their budget, as well as giving them overall direction for what they should study and how to study it, as well as I had an equal amount of money that I used to hire very sophisticated people from either laboratories that supported the Navy, other think tanks like the CNA Corporation I just mentioned, as well as I did a competitive contract every couple of years with industry to get the top people in industry to come in. And the whole focus of that was to perform studies and analysis to understand what, in fact, is the most important needs of the Navy, and then how that fit in with the overall joint force. So there was my activity had a parallel activity in each of the other three services. The Marine Corps had one, the Army, and the Air Force, and then that all came together at the Office of Secretary of Defense level, where they had another analytical organization, which today is called CAPE, Cost Analysis and Program Evaluation, as I believe what that stands for. And so their job was then to do what I optimized from the Navy, and their job was to optimize at the DoD level. So I spent, I guess, 30 years of my career working on that. Then I moved, I left the government and I went to Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and I led their National Security Analysis mission area, which was devoted to do the same thing. But now I was supporting, that was it's a nonprofit in a way similar to the Center for Naval Analysis, although much bigger, because beyond the small studies analysis piece that I ran, it was a large hardware development lab. So they did major system engineering. For example, the whole Aegis weapons system, for example, on Navy ships was essentially invented there, prototyped and then passed on to industry to actually field and build, as an example, just one of many programs at APO. But my focus there then was to do studies analysis and support not just Navy, the other services. I went out to all of our regional combatant commanders and had different levels of work with each one, and so on. So it was a very broadening. I thought I would get much more deeper into specific topics at a laboratory like Applied Physics Lab, and in fact, I got much broader. Then after all those years, only having an engineering degree and yet doing this work in the analytical world and interacting with all kinds of theorists such as yourself who understand who Clausewitz is and what he thought. I'd never read it or studied it, never had that background. So I have to thank my good friend and academic mentor, Tom Mankin, who from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he's still a professor, but he also happens to run the Center for the CSBA, one of the think tanks here in DC. Anyway, so he got me into SAIS, so I got a master's in global policy there. So after doing that, I left the applied physics lab, and that's what brought me now to working in Europe. Started out as a senior fellow with the Potomac Foundation, and then I left there with my partner, Dr. Peterson, to start the Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare. And our basic business model is going into countries such as Poland, Romania, Sweden, and helping the leadership understand the same things I did for the Navy. What is the military requirement? What do you need to buy? What's most important? What does it take to defend your country? How does that fit in with the overall aspect of NATO? And then which should you be buying and not buying? In some cases, I'm funded by industry. Other cases, I get funded directly by the government. It's all in a different way. But I think my philosophy in the work I do is just as it was when I was the Navy guy. My job was to be the honest broker analyst to figure out what the requirements were, what was the most important requirement, how much of it we needed, what was really needed for the military, and conveying that to the leadership. Now, in the U.S., generally, we follow that line. Now, of course, politics do intercede. And when it gets combined into a joint force, what is seen as a Navy priority may not be the same at the top. But maybe I'm going from background into the topics you want to talk about.
Yeah, just go ahead. Don't stop. This is exactly what I wanted to achieve.
Okay. So in that regard, we would take things into the joint force, and in the U.S., it's a little different. I mean, our threat sphere is broader because we're a global power. We have a combatant commander responsible for all areas of the world. So if you take the world and divide it up, there is a 4-star U.S. general who runs a combatant command who's responsible for it. Now, here you would know it as the European Command. Which is headed by the 4-star, who's also deputy headed as SAC Eur, and oversees the NATO aspect, the military aspect of NATO. But there are also others. So there's, for example, a very large and important one called Indo-Pacific, and that person has responsibility from India and China and all those regions. And so what we have is a requirements battle, I would say, in the U.S., where each service figures out what they should buy. And because in law, the services are designed to train and equip themselves. But then the warfighting requirement has to be balanced across these geographic regions, because what might be useful for EUCOM to be successful in any events they might have to engage in Europe or Africa or something like that would be different perhaps than what you need for China. So that's where we did have a lot of battles in terms of what the priorities are. And the combatant commanders wanted certain things, the services wanted certain things. So that led to a lot of conflict over what should be bought. But in the end, what was ideally put forward was the optimum answer, and that was done by a combination of the analysis we did in the Navy, what we did at the Office of Secretary of Defense level and the CAPE organization I mentioned, and then that had to be balanced with the need of the 7 regional combatant commanders, as well as a couple of other fixed commands, such as the Strategic Command, which has our nuclear weapons, or the Special Operation Command, or there's even a Transportation Command, for example. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I've done most of my career. So I brought that now into working into the European sphere. But why don't I stop there, and then you can push me in whatever direction you want.
Let's continue on that. Simply, on purpose, I just wanted to ask you, what is your take? You know Poland very well, you know Romania very well. We've talked about it in the past very often. So what is the structure of acquisition and purchasing? The sort of the thinking how to defend ourselves. What is your take on that? Just in crisp terms.
It's a lot different. Obviously, I'm dealing now in countries that were on the other side of the wall until 1990, and they were in some degree of communist-related sphere, or the Warsaw Pact, or part of the Soviet Union, or affiliated in some way with, like Romania was a little bit independent, but still had a dictatorship-type leadership that. More of a socialist type government. They all come from that background to start with. So, they really didn't have freedom until 1990 at the earliest. And then they've gradually over time joined NATO in almost every case, although I do deal with a few countries that aren't in NATO, like Sweden, and I've been to Ukraine a couple of times and looked at how they operate. And another thing that's a lot different is the existence, at least in Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, of large state-owned companies. We don't have that in the U.S. I mean, we have government laboratories, for example. I had laboratories that supported the Navy that were government employees. But they didn't build things. They didn't, they were similar to what you might find in industry. They were very smart technical people, but not, so when you needed a government authority to review things, you needed people like this, but they didn't build the end items. Whereas in, Romania and Poland and Ukraine, you have large companies that not only do all that, but they also build things. So they compete with what we have in the defense industry. Whereas in the US, all the production and things like that is pushed into industry. Even at the Applied Physics Lab, large lab where I worked for a decade, 5,000 employees, we didn't do production either. We built maybe the first prototype or two of something, or maybe the first missile, or actually, I'm not sure we ever built a missile, but, like the first weapon combat system, for example, for the Aegis platform I talked about earlier. So we might build a prototype, and then our job was to turn that over to industry, help the government compete the contract, and award it to an industry developer from that point. So what I'm seeing though, so there's, I guess I'm just setting up to say that there are different pressures, and because you do have a state-owned company that actually does the production, there's different pressures, and that you're trying to maintain a government entity to do that. Now, I'm not sure that's the best way to do it, but that's where you are at this point. I think it might be better for you to, if you could, run a good acquisition agency to break those things up and have them competed and turn them into commercial entities. I'll give you an example. So I pick on another country because I don't know enough about Poland, how it does it, but I did get inside the sphere of Ukroboronprom and see how they're set up. And they had 97 companies. I think only about 20 of them really bring in a whole lot of revenue. I'm not sure how many would be profitable in the real world, maybe only 5 or 10, I would think. And they're quite chaotic, and they're not that well run. So the current leadership there, I think it started with Zelensky, but it may have been the guy before him, has put in place a new leadership structure at the top that's trying to kind of turn them into more competitive, viable companies, and probably get rid of a bunch of the ones. I mean, I saw a plan where they're going to break it all up into 6 or 7 different groups, and then each one would then have to become competitive on their own. If they couldn't, then they'd get rid of it and go down from there. So there's the state-owned company thing, which is a new thing. I'm talking about it more just because it's new. I never had to deal with something like that on the U.S. side. But then it's a matter of, in Poland, is trying to find out who really has the military requirement. I mean, I can't say I'm an expert. I don't read Polish, so I have to depend on what people have told me. But it seems like you have the military, which itself is not, I don't quite understand the structure. I understand the structure if you go to war, but I don't understand the structure when you're not at war. And how do they actually advise the leadership on what to buy? It's not clear to me how that's done. Who does what I used to do? Who does the hard-hitting analytical work to figure out what Poland needs to defend itself? And second, and then I guess probably the second question then is, what does Poland need to do to fit into NATO and meet its responsibilities under the treaty there? It's not clear to me how that's performed in the government. I haven't found my counterpart. I haven't found the assessment division that I worked on for the Navy, and I haven't found the cost analysis and program evaluation activity that helped our overall Department of Defense, arbitrate the priorities amongst all the competing stakeholders. I don't see that entity in Poland. I haven't met those people. If they're there somewhere, I'd like to find them. So far,
good point. But for those people who might not, understand what you have been trying to say now, what does that mean? In very pragmatic terms, that there is no sort of the qualified assessment of the decision making as what to buy.
Right. Yeah. So how do you know what should you be buying? So I've watched this. I've seen a lot of defense companies that want to have products they want to sell and things that I think Poland should be buying and should have bought years ago if it wants to defend itself, yet they haven't bought it. I've watched it go from when I first got involved with Poland, I actually ran a Baltic maritime simulation because the big push was Poland was going to buy submarines, and the Swedes wanted to sell them theirs. So there was a big event around that, and I saw a lot of push to that. Then now we're at the point where they're not going to buy any submarines, and now the whole approach is we're going to build 3 FIGs, and that's the priority. And then that's
frigates. You mean, yeah?
Yeah, frigate. Yeah, FFGs or FIGs is what we call it in the US. Yeah, but 3 frigates. Actually, that frigate, as I look at what they want to put on it, is really more like a destroyer. It's more closer to an Aegis destroyer than it is really a frigate with all those VLS cells. And they're actually pursuing, several of the vendors are going to propose variants of the Aegis phased array radar, very sophisticated radar that goes on our US destroyers and cruisers. So it may be a frigate size, but it's going to be pretty powerful ship. More powerful than I think what the U.S. has on its current frigates, at least from my perspective. Although I'm not sure we have too many of those left anyway. There is a new frigate they're developing, but I'm not up on where that stands at the moment. But so my point is that, well, why was it once the submarine was a priority, and why is it now the frigate's a priority? And where was the analysis that said what's changed in the threat or the requirement? I don't think anything's changed in the threat that you need to defend Poland. It's the same threat today as we see going on in Ukraine, surrounding Ukraine, as it was 7 years ago. Maybe it's a little bit more sophisticated as the Russians have increased their capabilities, but it's the same threat. So that ought to be clear. There should have been an analytical element that said, here's what we need. But then that'll lead me to another pet peeve, is that while what I'm doing a lot of is wargaming, but I see wargaming as a way to explore problems and try to come up with what are the right questions to ask. But what I see in Poland is people think a war game is how you provide the answer. And that's, you can make an acquisition decision off a war game. That's a one-time run through.
Yeah.
So when I was in the assessment division, I said that 100 million a year we spent. So I was there for almost a decade. First, I was the head of readiness for the Navy, which was housed in that assessment division. And then I was the deputy director of it that was always headed by a 2-star admiral. And I had about, I guess, 7 or 8 different ones during my time there. They change frequently. I lost my point. So my point was coming back to say we did hard-hitting analysis, and that was good thinking, people strategically thinking through the problem, people maybe building and doing analysis and spreadsheets. And then we built a lot of very, very sophisticated detail, high fidelity models that people ran that would take, some of them would take 6 months or a year to do an analysis, even a year or more sometimes. They were so sophisticated and so detailed, a high level engineering, really examining all the details of how a weapon system would perform, how a missile would operate, and then aggregating that together to see what the overall effect would be. We didn't do a whole lot of wargaming, I'll tell you that. I mean, wargaming was occasionally done to help scope problems. It was up at the Naval War College. They did it to study strategy, things like that. But for acquisition decision-making, the wargame is not how to do it. But from what I understand, that's kind of what they do in Poland. In fact, I remember getting asked by a 2-star Polish general who I won't name, and he wanted to explore the algorithms in my wargaming model. And I just didn't even understand, why would he have that question? How important? It doesn't really matter, because the outcome of a war game is a one-time through. You only run it once. You can't really understand a problem doing it once. You got to look at it in a model thousands and thousands of times, It's a probabilistic simulation. You have to get some confidence interval. You have to come down to say, what's a likely outcome? And you just can't get to that in a one-time through game. But games are great to explore challenges, make sure what are the questions? What are the things that we need to understand or we don't know, that if we hadn't thought it through and put people in an operational situation, asked them how they might fight and behave it, that's great. Now, if you did 100 war games on the same problem, then maybe you get it. You can continue to refine it and see what the outcomes were. Or if you did war games to sort of start an analysis to understand and scope the problem, then went off and did high fidelity work with sophisticated models, engineering level models in some case, then you could come back and say, okay, well, now let's bring the operators back into it and run a war game. So I guess I would be a big advocate for that. There's really a need for a hard-hitting, long-term analytical organization. It should be staffed with career people, mostly civilians, although you need some military so that they understand the problem. And the military can rotate through it. The civilians are in the long term. And that's really, to me, a better way to have an understanding of what Poland would need to buy and what priority that it should be buying it.
Because, Greg, if this is not in place as you have just envisioned, then what, the political discretion comes in? I mean, the discretionary decision that is out of the blue might be chance to surface. What's the adverse outcome of that?
Well, let's use a contemporary example, I guess. As I looked at the frigate and tried to learn a little bit more about it in the last couple of weeks, it's clear that what's driving that, it may be the warfighting requirement too, but clearly what's driving that is political considerations. One is, should Poland have a navy? Two, should Poland be contributing to NATO missions, which aren't defense of Poland, but having a ship that can participate in NATO when it goes into the Med or the High North or into the Indian Ocean, wherever it is that NATO chooses to go? Does Poland want to be a part of that? Next, does Poland want to have a navy at all? If you don't have a ship, you don't have ships, there's no reason for a navy or a naval academy. And then does Poland need to have and I guess as PG said, the state-owned company, does Poland need to have an element of that knows how to build ships of some type, build and maintain ships? So it seems to me those questions were as much in the decision to build this ship as was the warfighting need. The warfighting need maybe could have been met without a ship, I don't know. But then, of course, you wouldn't have been able to meet the NATO mission. So I'm bringing in the fact there's a lot of political considerations getting into this. Now, I think in the U.S., there's no question politics matter. But I think in trying to decide most new programs, that is really a military requirement argument. It does ultimately get made by civilians. The acquisition process, the approval process goes from the Secretary of Defense, usually the Deputy Secretary provides that role. They have a person who's in charge of acquisition, and then each of the services has an acquisition chief that reports to that person. And so there is a civilian political system and their political appointees that does drive that to some degree, but there's no question that the military military civilian team places the clear military requirement of what we believe is needed to be bought, and it's done in a prioritized way. And I think at least initially when we start programs, generally they follow that path. And I don't think the politics drives it that much. Where the politics does get involved, though, is, for example, is once you do build it, for example, who wins it, which states is it going to be built in. And then once you start building something, it's hard to stop because the military says, okay, we built 50 of these ships and that's enough. We don't need enough, and we don't need a 51st. It's time to go to the next new thing, which is more important. We have enough ships in that problem. So that's when Congress will step in politically sometimes and say, oh, no, we're not going to do that because that ship is built in my state. And I've got 10,000 people in my state working on that ship, and I want to build 5 more. So that's really, the U.S., that's where it is trying to stop a program is where I see the biggest political influence.
Well, yeah, but Greg, if I may, but at the same time, such a political incursion, let me name it in that way, cannot completely annihilate the whole program or at least create a whole program, right? So it's only the balance and check here and there, a little bit here, a little bit there, but there is some sort of a, deep state thing or, the government and the whole institutional approach that is simply making the ship sail into the direction, right? Isn't it? So how would you, in general terms, describe this, Greg?
Are you talking about in Poland?
No, I'm talking about the U.S. that you referred to now, as opposed to, I understand, Poland, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, but I guess what I'm saying is that starting a program and developing a program and fielding a program, a weapon system or a ship or an aircraft is driven by military requirements. And those requirements are driven by analysis. They're driven by high fidelity analysis that each of the services performs, and they do that, and then in concert to some degree with the combatant commanders of what they need. Each activity has some analytical capability to do that, to say what do we need to win? First of all, what is the threat? What are the scenarios we might be in? And then what do we need to do to counter that? And I think it's well optimized. And I did not feel in general that there was that much political interference in the programs as we developed them. It was more, we figured out what to happen. We found out how much money we were going to get. And we were able to prioritize and buy the right things. 99% of it, well, maybe say 95% of the time. I think political decisions only interfered maybe 5%. But once programs existed, then that's what I'm saying. Once they existed, then you saw more political influence. But compared to Poland, I'm not sure I'm seeing the rhyme or reason for the acquisition decisions of what you're buying for your military. I mean, out of the blue, they're going to buy 250 M1s. Well, I think Poland should have some M1s. It's a very formidable tank and has a great exchange ratio against Russian tanks. And you face, the Sixth Army, potentially, definitely the First Guards Tank Army was designed to take on Poland, as well as the 11th Corps in Kaliningrad. And they have a lot of tanks. So having a superior tank to defeat the Russian tank threat is important. So I think it's a great decision, but I'm not sure where it came from. where was the decision made that you needed that many tanks, and why that tank? Was there an analysis done to compare it with other tanks? Did you go and look at all the different scenarios of how you might have to fight that tank? Because that one's a good tank, but it can't fight everywhere in Poland. On the other hand, maybe it can fight in certain areas, and other tanks can fight in other ways. I'd feel more comfortable if I had seen an analysis like that before a decision. But out of the blue, it was announced you're buying M1s.
And does the American industry say the same thing? What is the gossip in the corridors that the decisions are out of the blue? I mean,
yeah. So I think U.S. industry is pretty frustrated because they don't, at least in the U.S., who to go see. There's a program manager who builds an item that's responsible for it. So you go to talk to your program manager. There's the requirements people that decide what to do. There's politically appointed leaders in the Pentagon. And so you have people you can go influence and talk to, but at least there's a clearly understood process, a planning, programming, budgeting system, followed by all the rules and acquisition under an instruction called the Department of Defense 5000 series that tells you how to buy things. And so people have a set plan and rules to do it. Now, again, politics are everywhere. Surely there are exceptions. There are times programs have been shoved in from political purposes. That does happen in the U.S. too, but it's not the way it's normally done. And so most U.S. defense contractors know what the process is, know how to influence, know when they can engage, and it's understood. But I think the ones I talk to, at least trying to sell the things that they think that would be helpful to Poland, are very frustrated because they don't understand what the process is. Now, clearly, somehow the M1, which is built by General Dynamics, U.S. company, found a way to get that to happen. Although I don't really know how it happened. Maybe did they somehow market the solution, or maybe it was something that was decided upon by the political leadership in Poland. But I just don't know how the decision was reached. And if with all the time I'm spending in Poland and looking at things, if I don't understand that, then what does U.S. defense companies say? Well, I've been trying to sell my thing to them for a long time, and I'm not sure what the process is. When are they going to buy it? How are they going to decide? When are we going to hear about it? It's unclear and confusing from their point of view. And I know some companies that have backed off. They had offices, they closed them. Others are just reluctant to spend a whole lot of money investing in Poland because they don't know what the process is. Now, you could argue maybe Poland should buy and build their own stuff. Maybe it should all be homegrown. But nonetheless, from an outside point of view, it is frustrating to engage with that after dealing with the U.S. Not to say the U.S. process is perfect. It's very bureaucratic. It's very hands-off from allowing defense contractors to get involved and helping them figure out what to buy. So not to say they're entirely happy in the U.S., but at least the process is understood. And there is one. It's defined. There are instructions, the people that maintain the process. Sometimes it's too slow. For example, I'm just saying, let's be fair. So we're criticizing a little bit the lack of this process in Poland, but it can also become very bureaucratic. So as a result of that slow process, which is understood, sometimes things take a long time and become very expensive. So that's the downside to it in the U.S. For example, China has, I think, a more efficient process. So they're able to, complete engineering development, maybe 1 or 2 cycles faster than the U.S. can, and that's a distinct worry. So I don't want to say that U.S. is perfect, and that Poland is imperfect. I think they're both imperfect, but in different ways. But probably it would be better if there was a clearly defined requirements development process for how to define what you want to build in the military, and then a clear acquisition process by which things will be competed. Even so, like the companies I deal with, is it going to be an open competition? Is it going to be competed through a foreign military sales process? That's all up in the air too, and not just Poland. It's every country, every acquisition, every country. It's different. Sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's another. There's no consistency to it. Anyway, I babbled on about that enough. Why don't you ask me a few more questions?
Just that I really wanted to sort of completely cover this particular issues, as I haven't heard in the Polish internet the discussion about this yet. So I think at least to my knowledge, I don't want to insult anybody, but I think we are the first ones to cover it in such lengths. Greg, just let's really move away from this particular subject, and let's touch on Article 5, NATO Iron Article 5, that we have discussed so many times, and it was you, another American, strategists, analysts, and even generals that were warning me or admonishing me Jacek, Article 5 is a much more complex thing before it is triggered and so on and so forth. Then I had to come back to Poland and explain it to the public and the politicians, and they simply didn't believe me. So, Greg, could you elaborate on that? How is triggering Article 5 really affected? What sort of considerations we should take into account, in terms of crisis, war, and so on and so forth?
First of all, that there's many articles in the treaty. So Article 5, of course, is the one which is the collective defense if any member is attacked, that everyone would come to his defense. But you need to remember is that, like any place else, NATO is a bureaucracy. And the NAC is the committee that decides, when they all get together, to decide which article they're going to invoke or not. And there's a lot of politics to that. I think, at least my perception is, most Eastern European countries who joined NATO joined it because they said, oh, great, it's a relief. Now we have Article 5, so if we get attacked, everybody will come help us. And that's a notion, the right approach. I think the alliance of NATO is very important, and everybody stays together and speaks as one as best as they can against serious threats. And I think you're seeing right now, in the Ukrainian situation, a good example of how NATO and Article 5 could work. That's initially a lot of countries were very hesitant to take any aggressive action. Because, first of all, it's Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. So they could step back from that. But then even if it was a NATO member, you could see people were hedging their bets quite a bit. Germany has done a lot more business with the Russians. They got the Nord Stream 2. They're dependent on them for gas supplies. So they're less eager to be confrontive with a threat like Russia than, say, Eastern countries are more front-facing, such as Romania or Poland. But still, if in Article 5 you get to the situation where Article 5 is called, then I think the NAC meets and they could vote to say yes or they could say no. But the one thing to understand is that just because it doesn't have to be a consensus. You can have a coalition of the willing under NATO, and countries can come and fight under NATO. A few countries may say they don't want to for various reasons. That could happen. So it's not the end of the world if all 30 countries don't say yes on every single issue. The second thing I've learned in looking at it is that just because somebody agrees at a NATO meeting doesn't mean a country moves off to do it. So I'm not sure I'm talking Article 5 here, because we really haven't had an Article 5 formal attack since the existence of NATO, which sort of speaks to its strength. On the other hand, when you haven't done it, that means we haven't really done it for real, so we don't really know how it works.
Especially against the nuclear power, right? Like Russia, for example.
Well, yeah, against a nuclear power. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a consideration, but it's a balance of consideration. Like I just said, I mean, people in NATO could be weighing a lot of things. They could be weighing the strength of the enemy. They could be weighing the fact the enemy has certain weapons of mass destruction, nuclear or otherwise. They could be weighing their own economic situation, just like I mentioned with Germany and gas. They could be weighing other treaty partnerships that they have outside of NATO with certain countries. So there'd be a lot of considerations that each member of the NATO has to consider when they're deliberating under Article 5. However, I guess another thing I see about it, though, is as I look at the front, and my focus is really looking at the front. I don't like the word Eastern flank. That implies that there's a front somewhere else. There's only one front. It goes from Svalbard right down past your country, down into the Mediterranean. The Russians are on one side, and they're a few partners, and NATO's on the other side. That's the front. It's not an eastern flank. And so what I see is countries who have not seriously engaged with the concept that they need to defend themselves. If there were an attack, you have to defend yourself for a while. I mean, just think about it. So you go back, you get attacked, you go back, you meet in the NAC, whatever politics that takes, bureaucracy it takes for them to finally agree, whatever agreement. So let's just say they all meet as a consensus and agree, okay, yes, we're going to help defend you. Well, is everybody's equipment?
It takes time. It takes time. Yeah.
Is everybody's equipment ready? The answer is it's not. The readiness of individual countries is not a topic that is discussed at NATO. It's off limits. And I'm telling you, many countries are not ready. Second, is the equipment in the right location? Well, the U.S. is the biggest military in NATO, but we moved everything home years ago from the peace dividend. In the 90s, I think we don't, unless it's on a special exercise, which is called Atlantic Resolve, I believe, we don't even have any tanks or Apache helicopters in Europe, except for that rotational schedule. So at any one point, you might have, I don't know how many it is, 30, 50 M1 tanks, maybe couple of squadrons of Apaches and associated equipment and some jets and things like that. In fact, it's a public knowledge. You can get a chart to see what it is. The only question is where that equipment is. But that's all that's here. So if you have a conflict, the U.S. has to mobilize. It has to move all that equipment across the ocean. Obviously, some aircraft can fly in, but if you're talking about a ground battle where you need tanks and attack helicopters and things like that, that's going to take a while to get here. So countries need to design, I think, their militaries with two things in mind. One is, how do you defend your country and hold off the threat until NATO can get there? And then second, if it's not your country being attacked, how do you fit into NATO? I think it's instructive for anybody in this area to go and look at a publication that Diego Palmer Ruiz is his name. He's still at NATO, I believe, that he wrote on the reforger process, which was how we fought the inter-German border. In those days, each country had a region. Each country had their military equipment in country. Each country did the readiness preparations and things like that. They had all the logistics laid up, and then they practiced it in case there was an actual attack, how they would fight. But then that all went away with the Cold War ending, the wall coming down. That line is gone. Now we're all unified, but we don't have a thorough process to say, how are we going to defend? The border is now much larger, as I just talked about. I mean, that's thousands of kilometers from Svalbard down to the Mediterranean. So we haven't divided it up and says who's responsible for what part. So the problem is much more complex these days. We don't practice it in the same way. I think some of the recent exercises that we've had last couple of years are a step in the right direction. I forget the name of this exercise series, but the first one was in Norway, and then we've done one in Poland and in Romania in the last couple of years. These were attempts to get back towards the philosophy, I believe, of reforger, of saying, hey, we really have to practice and figure out how we're going to do this, who's going to move which forces where, how are we going to get it across and make it happen. And it's also led to some efforts, as our good friend and colleague, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges has been talking about his military mobility effort. And in fact, Jacek, you and I were a part of that work, that led the individual geographic pieces of the working group of that effort. But I think one of the things it showed is a real challenge to move things across Europe. There's a lot of issues. It's not just the physical capacity and ability, but there's also in terms of a lot of regulations involving moving military equipment to where it needs to go. So I think it's a very complex problem. I think if I sum it up simply, I think Article 5 is a good thing. I think NATO is a good thing. The alliance is very important. It's important it holds together. I'm very glad to see that in the end here with the situation in Russia, the alliance did hold together, even though the entire objective of Russia, I think, if they never attacked, I think in the end, their real objective was to try to see if they could break NATO. And I'm glad to see that is not going to happen. NATO did, in the end, spoke as one. There were some issues with it, but it all worked out in the end. So they did agree collectively to have the same position and stuck with the alliance. And I think that was important. And in fact, so far to date, it's never been tested. It has worked as a deterrence measure. NATO and the alliance has been successful because there simply has not been a war against a NATO country.
Yeah, Greg, but what do you think about this following situation, which is the one of the assumptions of our new model army that we have been developing on Strategy and Future, is that Article 5 works, but it takes time. And the Russians simply are probing the NATO cohesion, and they initiate some action within the new generation warfare. Non-kinetic, a little bit of kinetic, maybe, more of kinetic, but not a full-scale war. And also diplomatically and morally even, isolate the victim. For example, Poland, so that Germans and French and other guys have second thoughts whether to first of all trigger Article 5 and then to commit troops and before they really make a decision, commit troops, the game is over because Poland lost. So, the whole assumption is that we need to feel the force that is good enough to resist this pressure and keep not losing, so to speak, until the fog of war is cleared Everybody knows that there is war. This is the war of aggression. The Article 5 should be triggered, and the real stuff is showing up. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so I think there's two issues there. One I've already been speaking to is that each country needs to be prepared to defend itself for some period of time, because as we just talked about, it could take a long time for NATO to get there. I mean, a size force to expel a Russian occupation of Poland, some part or all of it, will take a long time to get here, a long time to mobilize, and Russia, of course, just as they will. Try to use all their national capabilities. They'll try to stop that force from getting to the location, whether it's through a submarine in the Atlantic Ocean or some other way that they can put a stop to it. So I absolutely agree that any force Poland has needs to be focused on slowing or stopping them as quickly as you can, and making it take as long as possible and as painful as possible for any sort of invasion. Now, do I really believe Russia would do that? I think more likely Russia is going to do things like what they did in the past in the Donbass or in Crimea or in areas of Georgia in 2008. They're going to snatch and grab what they can quickly and then try to negotiate, and then use all those influences of power to convince other parts of NATO that, hey, but look, y'all don't really want a war. And as you'll see, they will also use as you mentioned earlier, they also use the threat of nuclear weapons against you. They've already threatened, in fact, they already threatened the U.S. One Russian official threatened that he would send some nukes to our nuclear testing facility in the state of Nevada. So that's very typical. And they've also made nuclear threats before against, not too long ago, against, I think it was against Denmark. If you're going to be involved in this missile defense, just want you to know you'll now be one of our targeted countries. So first, as I think we've already talked about a fair amount, is the need for Poland to defend itself. And your conclusions in your study of the harassment zones and the kill zones in your new model army, I think are very wise. We came to the same conclusion with analysis. We didn't call it the same thing, didn't quite think about it the same way. But when we started looking at what it would really take to defeat their army, because it comes down to a tank battle, you have to kind of draw them in anyway to get to the right places to have those tank fights. So it kind of is a similar conclusion come to from slightly different angles to what you concluded. But let's go to another part of this, though, that you raised, and that is talking about non-kinetics, information warfare, cyber warfare.
Yeah, and if I may add, and let's also add, if you just compare it to the current situation that the Russians are undertaking, this at the New Generation Warfare Center in DC, you have been dealing with that. Yeah? So how does that fit into the current situation also around Ukraine and stuff?
I'm not sure I got that completely, but let me say what I was going to say, and then you can ask questions, and maybe I'll hit it. So my philosophy is that war exists both in the non-kinetic and kinetic realms. Article 5 is based on kinetic, that is a real physical attack on a country. And for that, NATO is a reactive force to stop it, either deters or reacts and expels the invader. That's the intent. NATO is not intended to go on any offensive fashion in the kinetic sphere, nor are they doing it in the non-kinetic sphere. And I think that's where we are making a huge mistake, because Russia has realized that you could win a war in the non-kinetic sphere. Yeah. You can win an information war. You can use your cyber capabilities, your abilities to insert your spies, your ability to insert information into a society, to manipulate social media, to manipulate people, to break apart countries and to break apart Western liberal democracies and bring them to their knees. I mean, that we were severely attacked by Russia in the election in 2016, not as well in 2020, only because our defenses got better. They tried to. I think we can show that Brexit had a huge Russian influence behind it. Their whole objective, again, is they want to break up the alliance NATO. They want to break up EU if they could as well. And so they're attacking these things very actively. And their Internet Research Agency, their GRU, and a whole host of contractors they have hired to do this. And to me, these are acts of war. These are acts of war that should be taken just as seriously as Article 5, and they have very huge impacts on our societies and messing inside of our freedoms and things like that. I mean, I don't know why we're sitting around letting essentially a autocratic dictator, do this to us without, repercussions. So I'm glad to see where we are essentially in our response to the latest thing with Russia to say, we're going to give you even more harmful and directed sanctions against Russia just for what you've been doing lately. Nothing to do with Ukraine. Even without even considering Ukraine, you need to be punished for this ongoing activity. We've told you to stop. You continue to do it, and it's all in the non-kinetic sphere. It's all information warfare, cognitive warfare, cyber warfare. There's many topics. For some people lump it under something called hybrid warfare. We really haven't agreed, or regular warfare. We really haven't agreed on what is the right term. But all of those things which people talk about, they're using those tools every day in a deliberate and conscious way to attack our societies. And we ought to say, it's not okay. This isn't just about, in my opinion, just telling them not to go in Ukraine. It's about, we ought to change the narrative. We're allowing him to drive the narrative. The narrative ought to be, you are an illegitimate leader, you're a criminal country, and your activities are simply unacceptable, and we see them as war. And I think in that spirit, NATO can be offensive and should be offensive. We ought to take the country to the ground. We should stop their electrical generation. We should not take any more that would, figure out a way to survive, have a plan to get off any Russian energy resource within the next 2 or 3 years. There ought to be aggressive actions taken in that direction, unless they want to change. Putin should step down. They should try to go back and maybe go back on the path they were in the early 90s to become a legitimate country with some form of legitimate government that has been elected, or some form that doesn't allow a small group of people like Putin and his oligarchs to amass all this power and then do what they want, particularly a country that has nuclear weapons. I mean, you need a more responsible government in there. You really do. So I don't think we're going far enough. I think we have to, frankly, be obvious, say, look, they're not going to speak of it now because they don't want to start a war. But ultimately, our goal should be regime change and to stop allowing him to do the things he's been doing. Anyway, why don't I stop there and push me whatever direction you want me to go?
Yeah, I really wanted to touch base also on some maybe future scenarios, how the situation might. What is your personal opinion? How the situation around Ukraine may evolve? How can it, touch Poland? Taking into account that yesterday Poland announced that it would procure weapons to Ukraine, and taking into account that the Russians are deploying forces to Belarus, right, to our border, and taking also into account this Chinese thing, Western Pacific. You've been dealing with that, yeah, primarily. This is how I met you. So this focus on the Western Pacific that, probably when you are in DC, maybe not in these weeks when this Ukraine crisis is unfolding, but basically it's all about China, isn't it? How just please, tell us something more about all this, all those factors, zoom in and zoom out.
Well, I don't think it's all about China. I think China's obviously viewed as the long-term challenge, that what we have with Russia is a more shorter-term threat. But I think in the shorter term, clearly, Russia is a more lethal threat. I think, in the end, China has some massive problems too. And really, I think if we just didn't have Taiwan, I think we probably would get a conflict point. We may get to a conflict point with China because of Taiwan, and there's a lot of strategies you can go into that. But I guess I can't predict what's going to happen in Ukraine. I could see him doing enough to change the government. If he just changed the government back to a Russian-leading government like it used to be before 2014, he'll probably back away and be happy. But the people there won't. It's too late. They know what it's like in the West. As you well know, there's 2.5 million Ukrainians living and working legally in Poland today. They've seen how your societies move forward, how it's much nicer. I mean, if you've been on the Russian side of the wall and lived there, and if you've been, say, living in Warsaw, you can see there's a big difference. Do they really want to go to that? So Ukraine's had too big a taste of the West. So I wonder what would really happen if he did change the government. But he's got the forces in the right place that he He could go far enough in to change it. I don't think he's going to really try and invade the whole place, but he might also back down. It's possible. I mean, he's clearly publicly realized that he's not going to achieve what he wants. And the consequences of him achieving it by force, I think he's now realizing has really put him between a rock and a hard place. So I think from U.S. priorities, though, I think this is equally balanced now. I believe, didn't we increase the U.S. Army Europe commander back to a 4-star? Did I hear that correctly? I mean, I think the priorities are there. I think that our eyes are on the problem now. I think we see what the responsibilities are. Although I think the one thing that won't change now, this is not a criticism of Poland. They're the leading country in doing the right thing, is forcing NATO countries to meet their investment obligations for military. But even there, it's sort of like with Poland and the other countries of criticism earlier, is that we've picked an arbitrary factor of 2%. What I'd like to see is a comprehensive analysis of what does it take to defend NATO. Just like I'm saying, what does it take to defend Poland? There should be a comprehensive analysis across all NATO. And then we got to figure out what NATO needs to buy. Who needs to buy what in order for them to prevail and defend everybody? And I don't know if that's 2% of everybody's budget or 10%. I don't know what the right number is. But clearly people aren't spending enough, and countries are not ready. The readiness levels are not sufficient to be ready for the battle. Did you want me to turn to China a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so China is a much different thing. It's a much bigger power. I think the challenges are more of who is really going to lead the world. Are we going to be led by a democratic country, as flawed as it is, like the United States? And we've sure been tested in the last few years with our democracy, but we've survived so far. Are we going to be led by open standards, by democratic elected leaders in terms of what the standards of our societies are and how we're going to operate the world? Or are we going to be led by a communist party, a very small, you say it's 1.4 billion people, but Communist Party is relatively small. I think it's only like 1 million or 2 people are actually in it, in a very, very small group, or get to make all the decisions. Are we really going to be led by that sort of thinking and that smaller group of that control of society? I mean, look at what's going on with the Uyghurs, where this is a region that isn't part of the original Han Dynasty, off to the west, and they're forcing them into basically to give up their faith, their Muslim faith, and think like everybody, basically mind programming everybody to think the same way. Is that the kind of world we want to live in? That's really more of what I think is at issue with China. I don't know that. I mean, I think the economic development and business is very important to China, more important than any ideology at this point. Putin, on the other hand, is back in love with the Ruski mirror and promoting that. But I think he's thinking of his legacy and the myth that appeals to some traditionalists in Russia. China, I think, is really, I don't even want to call it a communist party, really. It's an organized gang who decides they want to stay in power. It's not really based on a philosophy. Given now that they're 100% bought into economic development and making money and growing businesses and that kind of thing. So I think there's a reasonableness behind it in China that I think will prevail in the end. We can. I think it's easier. They're not. I mean, Putin's basically a thug. He's a thug. I don't know how else to describe him. I don't think the Chinese are thugs. I think they're basically business people in the end at this point, and they're going to do the right thing for business of their country to maintain it. And they're going to have huge problems come down the road. They have 1 billion people who are not being educated, and they have a hukou system that discriminates against them and keeps them in the second string healthcare, second string access to resources and education, and they're not growing and educating them. And we have a crisis coming as technology evolves, as AI gets here. We're going to begin to get to where so many machines do what people used to do. That you no longer need them for that. So what are they going to do with those 1 billion people? For example, in 10 years, you would not have 2.5 Ukrainians in your country, because what are they doing? I mean, every Uber I get in Warsaw is driven by a Ukrainian. Those jobs are not going to be here in 10 years because the car is going to drive itself. So I guess my point is because of the technology evolution, there's a lot of coming things which is going to make it very difficult for the Chinese society to prevail. That it may fail of its own doing, as opposed to any conflict with the U.S. Now I can go into the military analysis of all that, and who would win and how you would fight it. But I think it would just be a lot of destruction and mess. And I'm not sure there'd really be a clear winner. I mean, the United States is not going to invade China, and China is not going to invade the United States. It would just be a matter of how to control it. And a big, messy war would destroy all their trade, would destroy their economy. I mean, I don't think it would destroy the U.S. economy as badly. I mean, I think China would get the bad end. Even if they won the war and sunk all of our ships and tried to get us out of there, I think the impact to them would be much greater. So I think they would be very, very cautious to go to this level. I think it's more of just their need to control their society, and that's what's driving their views at this point. But nonetheless, if we don't provide a credible threat, and I think really it's just about Taiwan at this point. But there's so many ways you could defend Taiwan. I mean, all Taiwan, it's just like Taiwan has an ace in the hole. So, one way you could stop the Russians is you could blow all the bridges between them and you, right? And then, just focus all your efforts to stop them building new bridges so they'll never get to Warsaw. I mean, there's ways around it perhaps, but Taiwan has a similar thing. I mean, they have a stranglehold on the special semiconductor industry against the whole world, and which dominate much of the industry and high-tech industry in China. So all Taiwan has to say, fine, if you're going to attack us, then we're just going to blow up all the semiconductor plants. And that alone will crush the Chinese economy. So I think when people step back and look at the economic impacts, and I think in the end, ultimately, it's about the money, both in China and in the U.S. I think they're going to find a way. They're going to find ways around this, not to have the conflict, even if different ideologies are going there. But on Putin's case, though, I'm not sure we're dealing with a reasonable man anymore. At the end of the Trump era, the problem was that there were no reasonable people around him anymore to advise him, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, leading up to the January 6th event. In the end, I think the last person standing that had anything reasonable to say was his daughter, telling him, hey, you got to stop this. And it took her 3 or 4 hours, but that was it. It wasn't for her. I don't think there was anybody left that he was listening to, other than yes men and women that surrounded him. I think we have the same problem with Putin. He's been in power so long, there are no longer any reasonable people around him, and they're just feeding his disbelief about the world and feeding his belief in this Ruski Mir myth that he has to have this as his legacy. I mean, he could stop all this. He could say, look at the economics of my country. It's not going very well. Let's stop spending all the money on defense. Let's get a clear guarantee the U.S. will not invade us. And NATO will not invade us, and whatever measures that makes them feel more comfortable, but it can't be additional geographic space that he's trying to obtain in Belarus and Ukraine and other countries. And then turn to trying to what we tried to do in the early 90s unsuccessfully, and try to make them more of an economically viable country. It's not too late. But I don't know. I think it may be too late for him as a leader to realize and understand this. And there just isn't anybody around him to get the message across. So we have a real dilemma there. However, in China, I think we are still talking to reasonable people that can understand and can negotiate, and we can make some progress. So I don't think it has to lead to a conflict. I know other people think it's going to be a conflict no matter what. And I'm not sure I agree. And I think, and if like I said, I think if it weren't for Taiwan, it would be much easier. We're still going to have struggles. Taiwan is, in a sense, to China as Ukraine is to Russia. It's the same kind of issue, and it'll be a battle to see how that's all going to work out. But I don't mean a battle in terms of necessarily a military conflict, but a battle of societies and who's going to be primary or not. Hopefully, we can find a way to coexist. I've lost you.
Yeah, I was muted.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think it's good time we, just, stop this conversation in a way that we have covered Russia, we have covered China, we have covered acquisition, procurement, Article 5. And unless you want to add anything else, Greg, we'll be wrapping out after 1 hour of conversation.
I think we probably hit them hard enough for now, unless you had any more questions. Well, thanks for a chance to chat with you. I hope I had some useful views, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions or elaborate further. But you have to send if you send them to me in Polish, I could translate them on Google.
Yeah. I think that the viewers, the audience will want more. I know them, so I know what they like more or less. So I know they will like it, especially this part about Article 5 and procurement system. that's going to be very interesting, and this is what I wanted to also to achieve, honestly speaking, in our conversation.
Actually, I will add one last point, is that I did talk to somebody who actually put together a proposal for a capabilities-based acquisition system, requirements and acquisition proposal to the Polish government, and documented it. I don't want to, I haven't seen it in English, so I don't know if it's good or not, but I just know that someone has worked on something like this and suggested it. So I think there are homegrown solutions inside of Poland to trying to get at the issue that I was bringing up. So, maybe you don't necessarily have to follow the U.S. model, but there have been people that have studied the U.S. and other countries and how they do it, and have made proposals for how Poland might change. And maybe those should be looked at again in Poland.
Okay, just
it's homegrown.
Let's hope for that, and let's believe that this will happen. I completely share your opinion. Capabilities-based model, and also some sort of the agency that will be providing the military contribution to what we should procure, and it should stem from the strategic perspective and not just buying randomly, whatever yep. Roughly speaking, politicians wish. Yeah, so this is exactly the thing. Okay, Greg, thanks a lot. Our guest today was Gregory Melcher, New Generation Warfare Center in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Greg, again. And my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Stay with us at Strategy and Future.
Take care.